Privilege to welcome to the platform Bill McKibben.
Well, and what a great privilege for me to get to be here. I'm very grateful to the university and to all the staff of the Ideas lecture series. And I'm also, oddly, find myself quite grateful after 36 hours in Sydney to the journalists of Australia. I don't say this lightly. Often one of the great perils of traveling the world and lecturing and talking is having to spend a lot of time being interviewed. But in the last 24 hours, I've been interviewed 4 or 5 times now at the ABC studio, and each one has been better than the one before. More interesting. You should be very proud of Adam Spencer and then Margot O'Neill and then Philip Adams, and then this morning the great glorious pleasure of Margaret Throsby, yes, and her program, and we were talking about music and about the world. It was quite glorious, and I'm afraid that it got me in the mood for telling stories. I'm a little worried about that because ideas are supposed to be our brief tonight, and I'll try to toss a few ideas in as we go along, but stories in a sense are how I perceive the world, and I think how most people perceive the world, and they are what move us to action, and in fact it is action to which I will try to move you before the evening is out. It seems to me that ideas on which we do not act curdle. So stories, and old-fashioned stories at that. I know you're quite used to the world of PowerPoint and images. I have been at work on a more advanced and kind of carbon-free technology that I call virtual PowerPoint. And should it work correctly, the pictures will appear in your head as I talk, okay? So we shall see. First story. In Tibet, some few years ago, doing a story for the National Geographic, and I was in a very remote part of Tibet, even remote for Tibet. We'd driven for all day, and the Land Rover had crossed one stream after another, and we'd finally gotten to a small village, not even really a village, just a collection of 5 or 6 huts. And we got out, and one of the young men at the village, maybe 17 or 18, offered to take me and my interpreter up for a hike to the base of the glacier that overlay this village. And so we hiked for about an hour up the river and eventually got to its base and lay there looking up under the snout of this enormous and beautiful Himalayan glacier. But he was pointing out a huge black rock the size of, a 10-story apartment tower or so, that was melting out from sort of the middle of this glacier. And he said that, just appeared last year. It had never, we've been in this village for many, many generations, and all of a sudden this black rock appeared and it's melting out. Now, we were very far away from electricity, from radio, from television, from schools, from the world of literacy in any respect. So I was kind of curious I said, why do you think that's happening? And I don't know quite what I expected, maybe some story about the gods or something. He looked at me like I was, a visitor from the planet Dimwit, and he said, that's global warming, too many factories. I said, I've heard about that. And down we walked to village, and I climbed back into the Land Rover and drove back to the airport and got on the airplane and flew on home. Story 2. Maybe a year later, I was in Bangladesh, one of the most beautiful countries on earth. I'm sure many of you have been there. If you haven't, you should try to contrive an opportunity to visit. One of the most glorious and green spots on the whole planet. quite crowded, 140 million people living in an area the size, I always say, of the American state of Wisconsin. That probably won't do much for you, but in a narrow area, very densely populated, and yet they feed themselves because the land is so fertile. It's where the great sacred rivers of Asia, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, come pouring down out of the Himalaya and into the Bay of Bengal. So each year there's a gentle August flood that leaves behind a layer of silt that allows a fertility unparalleled almost any place on the planet. Extremely beautiful, and in trouble now for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into at the moment. You can guess at them as sea level rises and glaciers melt. But the problem that was happening when I was there was less chronic, more acute. They were having their first big outbreak of a disease called dengue fever, a mosquito-borne disease that the World Health Organization says will be the emergent disease of the 21st century. A disease that is spreading with enormous rapidity, incidence up 200, 300, 400% across South America and Asia this decade, because the mosquito Aedes aegypti that carries it is very sensitive to changes in humidity and temperature. It really likes the warmer, wetter world that we're busy creating. They were having their first big outbreak in Dhaka, the Bangladeshi capital, when I was there. And I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so I got bit by the wrong mosquito. I became very sick as I've ever been. Unpleasant, they call it break-bone fever. But obviously I survived. Lots of other people didn't survive. Lots and lots of people died. Old people, young people, people who weren't well nourished going into it. And I remember going to the hospital ward and looking, much bigger room than this, with cots sort of stretching into the distance, and on each cot someone shivering, and there weren't enough cots, so there were people in between them on the floor shivering. And I remember thinking, in between my own shivers, my main thought was, these people have done nothing to deserve this. The UN tries to measure how much carbon each nation on Earth emits each year in the hope that we might do something. Bangladesh, you really can't even get a number for. It's a rounding error in the calculations. Most people aren't connected to the electric grid. People use their feet to get around. The bicycle rickshaw is a main means of transportation. It's a very sustainable place in that way. My country produces, the 4% of us who live in the States, 25% of the world's CO2. Though it's not epidemiologically correct, I guess, it seems to me the moral mathematics of that is pretty clear. 1 bed in 4 in that hospital ward is on us. And since Australians are the only people that keep Americans from being at the top of the league table in terms of per capita emissions, I won't say what that says about all of you. That's a very sad story, obviously. It has one twist at the ending, but I won't tell it to you for a little while. I'm going to back up from those intimate stories for a minute and tell you just the outlines of the larger story, the story you already know, the story of climate in our time, just to bring you up to speed with where we are. I wrote the first book about global warming 20 years ago this year. That's about how long we've really known about this problem. At the time it was a hypothesis. It seemed extremely scientifically obvious at some level. We were pouring carbon into the atmosphere and we knew a good deal about its molecular structure, okay? But it was emotionally counterintuitive. How could we have grown large enough as a species that we affect everything happening on the surface of the Earth? To get over that disbelief, science went to work with more ammunition, more resources, more brain power than they'd attacked any other question in a similar period of time. And really by 1995, the world scientists had reached a workable, rough and ready consensus that indeed human beings were heating up the planet and it was going to be a serious problem. And since 1995, it's been as if the Earth itself has been peer reviewing that science to make sure that they got it right, okay? All 10 of the warmest years on record happened since then. That consensus has deepened and strengthened with each passing year, with each set of observations. That's the part of the story that you know. What you may not quite perceive yet is that in the last 18 months, that consensus has turned, at least on the leading edge of the science, into a kind of panic. And that's because things are changing much faster and on a much larger scale than we anticipated. Scientists that I've known for a quarter century, who've always been concerned and worried and sober about all this, are now frightened and willing to say so quite loudly. I recommend to you the current issue of Nature, one of the world's 2 preeminent scientific journals, which talks a good deal about this number 350 and the state of the scientific play. Basically, there are 2 things going on to explain this panic. One, the amount of change that we're seeing given the rise in temperature is more than we expected. So far, we've raised the temperature of the planet about 1 degree. 20 years ago, we would have said that would be taking us just to the threshold of the global warming era, that we'd be feeling the first effects, but we'd be sort of looking out into the distance at real change. It turns out the planet was more finely balanced than we understood. One of the signal moments was 2007, when in the summer we had an extremely rapid melt of Arctic sea ice. By the time it was done melting in September of 2007, there was 25% less than there had ever been before. Very powerful illustration for everyone of what was going on. It's not just ice. I mean, everything frozen on Earth is melting, but lots of other things are happening too. Our hydrological cycles are in a state of spasm. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold air does. That means that in arid areas, we're seeing dramatic increases in precipitation, in evaporation, and hence in drought, and that drought is measurable all over the world. And since that water, once it's up in the air, will come down eventually, in wet areas we're seeing incredibly dramatic changes in flood and deluge, in the number of storms that drop 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, in real extremes. Australia is one of the places, along with the high Arctic, where that change, where scientists around the world point to as one of the real early harbingers of how you can see that change in operation. The rapid drying of Australian rivers and the extreme heat and aridity that contributed to the devastating brush fires earlier this year are signals to scientists of the kind of change that we're seeing. I was at the Climate Institute yesterday and looking at their data on the truly unprecedented nature of heat and aridity that contributed to those devastating fires this year, and the way that that has been accumulating and building up in recent years is profound and frightening. I've told you about the rapid spread of disease vectors across the planet, but those vectors attack not only human beings, they attack plants as well. Across huge swaths of the north, across Canada and now the Rocky Mountains down in the United States, in the last 3 years we have seen forests die off on a scale really not recorded before on this earth. Literally tens of millions of acres of pine trees with not a single living one left. And that's because the pine bark beetle that attacks them, which has always been there, but always been held in check by cold temperatures in the winter that produce high mortality and reduce its reproduction, no longer encounter those stretches of 30 below in the winter, and hence are multiplying at enormous rate. I could go on listing changes like this for a very long time, but I want to move on to factor 2 in that panic. It's not just that the Earth turns out to be very finely balanced. It's that when you begin to upset that balance, a number of feedback loops start kicking in that soon will take this problem beyond our ability to control. What do I mean? When you melt that ice up in the Arctic, you take a nice white shield off the top of the Earth that reflects 80% of incoming solar rays, and you reflect it with blue water that absorbs 80% of them. You amp up the reaction. When that ice has to refreeze in the winter, in the freezing process, it gives off heat. That heat, in a process that scientists call Arctic amplification, has spread inland. It's measurable 1,500 kilometers south. The main effect is the rapid melting of permafrost underneath the tundra and the taiga. It turns out that what's under that permafrost are enormous volumes of methane, which is now leaching out into the atmosphere. Scientists the last 2 winters in the far north have reported that ponds and streams aren't freezing even at 40 below zero because there's so much methane bubbling out from beneath that it's keeping them open like a fountain. Okay? Once those forests have died, they begin not to soak up carbon the way that trees usually do, but to give it off. The soil becomes a source of carbon, and if those trees catch on fire, which they increasingly have, then they become themselves a kind of carbon bomb, producing enormous quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere. The point is, the scary point is, that at a certain place, this becomes impossible for us to control. We set this chain of events in motion by putting carbon in the atmosphere, by running cars and factories and power plants. Theoretically, we could stop that, and we'll talk about how that might happen in a little while. But at a certain point, even if we stop that, we won't be able to stop these other effects. We have no practical plan for refreezing the Arctic, for refreezing the tundra, for turning those dead forests back into living ones. Okay? The point of all of this is that global warming is not some future threat, one of several on a list of problems that we need to be doing something about. It is a capital E emergency that we have to address now, and that if we do not address now, we may not be able to address ever. Time is much shorter than we had understood. We do not know exactly how short it is, but the best guesses are extremely sobering. Rajendra Pachauri, the Indian-born scientist who, as head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, accepted the Nobel alongside Al Gore 2 years ago, said recently that if we have not begun to make very fundamental reforms of our energy systems by 2012, that it may well be that we will never get back ahead of this curve, if it's possible even at this point to do so. One good thing has happened in the last 18 months. And that is that we finally have a number to crisply express our peril. Before the Industrial Revolution, the atmospheric concentration of carbon in the atmosphere was 275 parts per million, plus or minus 10 parts per million for all the 10,000 years of the Holocene. So depending on your predilection, that's the Genesis number, the Buddha number, the Shakespeare number, that's the world from which we came, okay? On comes the Industrial Revolution, we begin to burn coal and gas and oil, that number begins to mount, but we never know just where the red line is, and given human nature, we always hope that it's a little further out in the distance so we can get to this problem and deal with it, or really rather so that our children can get to this problem and deal with it and we won't have to. But when the Arctic melts, that tells you that you may have crossed this line already. And in fact, after that sequence of events, many of our best scientists went back to work. An American team led by James Hansen at NASA and his colleagues, really our foremost climatologists, published a paper in January of 2008 that gave us a number. And that number, and it's the most important number on the planet, though we never knew it till 18 months ago, was 350 parts per million CO2. Any number greater than that, they said in the abstract of a peer-reviewed scientific paper, was not compatible with the planet upon which civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted. Strong language and a very strong number, especially strong when you consider that we're already past it. We're at 387 parts per million and we are rising. We are not like the guy who went to the doctor and the doctor said, you know, keep eating cheese at each meal and sooner or later your cholesterol will be too high. We're like the guy who went to the doctor and the doctor said, look, your cholesterol is way too high and you're going to have a heart attack. You better hope you get it down before the heart attack happens. Well, we are having the heart attacks. That's what it means when all of a sudden your rivers start drying up or your Arctic starts to melt or whatever it is. Okay? We have to get it down. And 350 is not a magic talismanic number, you know. 351 does not represent damnation and 349 salvation. In fact, it's doubtless somewhat lower than 350 that we'll need to go, and we talk always about less than that number, but it serves as a rallying point to understand the predicament in which we find ourselves. It tells that number, it tells a story. And of course, it raises a question. And that question is, what will we do about it? The odds of doing anything about it are tough, as you found out here in Australia this week when your Prime Minister, who had fought an election campaign on this issue, found that he didn't have the backing to do what he wanted to do, and at least for the moment has had to step back a little bit in order to fight another day. The reason that it's tough, well, there are 4 reasons that it's tough. Now I feel more like a lecturer. There are 4 reasons that it is tough. Okay? 1, this is no trace gas we're talking about. Fossil fuels are the most integral part of our economy, and when you burn them, you can't help but produce CO2 in enormous quantities, you know. 2, because they're so integral, they're very heavily defended in every country on Earth. Australia has a huge coal industry, so it defends it. I've just spent a week in New Zealand. They have a big agricultural industry that they don't want to talk about its emissions. The United States, of course, most addicted of all. And the industries that have profited from those addictions have very little interest in seeing them change. ExxonMobil made more money last year than any company in the history of money. And they have proven more than willing to spend large sums of that money to make sure that serious action doesn't get taken. So that's point 2. Point 3, it's tough because time is short and hence the kind of obvious strategies aren't enough. That is, given enough time, the sensible way to go about this would be a sort of gradual change in our cultures and attitudes. We would learn to put in the right light bulbs and drive the right cars and build good public transit systems slowly. And over time, we'd make our houses more efficient and our businesses more efficient and so on and so forth. But we don't have that time, and hence that strategy alone is insufficient. You cannot solve this problem given its scale and given the short hour, one light bulb at a time, one house at a time, one car at a time, one community at a time, one campus at a time. You can't even really solve it one nation at a time. If it's going to be solved, it's going to be solved by global action very soon to reset the price of carbon, to send a strong market signal that carbon is no longer a free good to be poured into the atmosphere willy-nilly, but in fact is a dangerous commodity for which the price of putting it in the atmosphere will be high enough to deter you from doing it. Okay? 4, it's tough because there aren't enough of us mobilized to care about it. edited an anthology last year for the Library of America, a huge doorstop of a book, 1,000 pages of American environmental writing since Thoreau, okay? It was painful in a sense to do. All anthologizing mostly consists of cutting things out that you would like to leave in, so I don't recommend it to any of you in a sense. But it was very interesting work because it allowed me to look at the scope of the environmental movement as it's developed in America, and this is one place where America in many ways has led the world in developing the environmental idea and all that's flown from it. And it's a very noble story in America, in here, all around the world, okay? I mean, it's a quite beautiful notion that we've developed a movement with the quite altruistic idea often of caring for things that aren't us and don't benefit us directly. But that movement is scaled, as we were saying earlier today in a series of really useful meetings, that movement is scaled to save whales, to create national parks, to force you to put a catalytic converter on your car so smog doesn't fill the Sydney sky. Tough challenges, but not central to our economic life. They took real activism to make happen, but they're not like taking on the most central parts of our economic life. And it is unrealistic and impossible to imagine that the environmental movement as currently constructed is big enough to be able to deal with the problem that we face. It simply isn't scaled appropriately to do it. We cannot change of those four tough things, 1, 2, or 3. We cannot change the fact that this is the most integral part of the economy, that it is extremely well defended, and that time is short. The one thing we can change is the size of the movement of people who want to do something about it. In short order, we need to build a real movement, and that's what I want to finish by talking to you about tonight. We have, I think, the necessities to allow that to happen. We have a target, this number 350 that defines our peril. We have a moment. The world's leaders meet in Copenhagen in December at the end of this year. They're to draw up a new climate pact. It is the last plausible bite at the apple that we have in order to get the architecture of this system right. We have a set of tools that we didn't have even a few years ago that allow us at least some leg up against the very large power possessed by all the money on the other side. And that tool is the net and the connectivity that it provides and the ability occasionally for things to virally now reach out into the world. And we have, and here's what I want to talk to you about, here's what my work is at the moment, a strategy for using that target and that moment and that set of tools. I want to tell you another little set of stories about how, well, in a sense, about how my life has changed in the last few years. And the theme of this is, if someone as clueless as I can engage in this work, then so can some of you, and I hope you will. When I came back from that trip to Bangladesh, here's the twist at the end, something in me had snapped. And it no longer seemed enough for me to speak and to write about these questions. I wanted to do something because there had been no action in the United States and no real action in the world to change the course, the momentum of this problem in the 20 years that I had worked on it. But I had no idea what to do. I am a writer. I live in the woods in the small rural state of Vermont. You know, writers are not, we're self-selected to sit in our rooms and type, you know. That's what we do. I had no idea what to do. I called up a few of my writer friends in Vermont. I said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go up to our main city, Burlington, Vermont, 50,000 people, not such a big city, but it's as much as we've got. We're going to go up there and we're going to sit in on the steps of the federal building and we're going to get arrested and there'll be a story in the paper and at least we will have done something. All of these guys as clueless as I. That sounds like a very good plan. Let's do that, you know. Somebody happily calls up to the police in Burlington. What would happen? The police said, Nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, you know. We'll come visit you. We had quickly to recalibrate. I started sending out emails to everybody that I knew. Said, we're going to go for a walk. And a couple of weeks later, we left. We left from Robert Frost's old summer writing cabin up in Vermont. Some of you know the American poet Frost, and our most beloved poet and our kind of patron saint in Vermont. So we left from his cabin and we walked for 5 days, and we slept in farm fields at night. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I had alerted the Methodist mafia en route, and we had churches in which to give addresses in the evening and things. And we reached Burlington, and there were 1,000 of us walking. And in Vermont, God, 1,000 people is a horde. This was more people than anybody had ever. The cows were bolting in terror from the fence line. More than enough people to lure all of our politicians who were running for office down to the shore of Lake Champlain for a rally. And they not only came and spoke, they signed this raggedy piece of cardboard that we had been carrying across the countryside that said, if elected, they would work to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050. At the time, an extremely radical target. Nobody in Washington interested, only scientists endorsed it, okay? Everybody signed, even not just the liberal Democrats, you know, but the conservative Republicans. The woman who was running for Congress on the Republican ticket had said 2 months earlier when she announced, she said what too many politicians there, and I believe perhaps here too, say. I'm not sure global warming is real. More research needs to be done, okay? The more research that needed to be done, it turned out, was on the topic, how many people will walk across Vermont and ask me to change my mind? And the answer, empirically, turned out to be that 1,000 was sufficient because she signed, okay? The only downer in this process was to open the newspaper the next morning, and there's a story that says these 1,000 people may have represented the largest demonstration that had yet taken place in the United States about climate change. When I read that, I thought, no wonder we're not doing so well, you know? We have the superstructure of a movement. We have Al Gore, we have scientists, we have policy people, we have everything we need except the movement part, you know, to give it some weight and some heft. How can we build that? With 6 college undergraduates, one of whom my colleague John Warno is here tonight. We launched in January of 2007 a website, the answer to all modern problems, a website, okay? Step It Up 07, and we didn't have any money and we didn't have any organization, just the 7 of us. We started sending out emails to everybody we knew. Will you organize a rally with this same demand, okay? And from hither and yon, we thought we might organize 100 of these. That was our secret hope. Instead, it turned out there were lots of people who wanted to do something. They just didn't know what to do. They knew changing light bulbs was not enough, but they didn't know how to plug in some way that made sense. 3 months later, on the day appointed, there were 1,400 demonstrations that took place in all 50 states. It was the biggest day of grassroots environmental activism in the United States since the first Earth Day. It was extremely beautiful. There were big underwater demonstrations on the coral reefs on Key West. There were thousands of people doing, you know, ascents of glaciated peaks out west that aren't going to be glaciated much longer. I started the day in Lower Manhattan. There were thousands of us in blue shirts holding arms like this. The effect we wanted was a human tide line, because New Yorkers tend to have a somewhat real estate-based view of the world. We wish to show them which of the real estate would soon be underwater. It was very beautiful as these images came in from all around the world, all around the country. It was also very effective. 3 days later, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama dramatically changed their energy and environment platforms and adopted that target that we had given them, dramatically stiffening what they had promised. And we're now seeing the fruits of that in the early days of the Obama administration. Okay. This is the kind of work that you all have already done in Australia, a place that's had a really profound climate movement in recent years, and it's been great fun over the last couple of days to meet some of the groups and people who make that happen, the ACF, the Climate Institute, Greenpeace, Get Up, the Green Party. Especially sweet for us to meet the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. Since I'm an organizer, I will say here are 3 things I've heard about in the last 2 days that you should know about. Next Saturday on the 16th at 10 in the morning in Town Hall Square, the Nature Conservation Council is hosting a big gathering to figure out how to respond to events of this past week. On Saturday, the 13th of June, there'll be national climate emergency rallies around the country, climaterally.org. Most beautifully for me, in mid-July, the Youth Climate Coalition is hosting a big gathering of students from all over Australia called Power Shift. It's modeled on work that's happened in the United States. When we had the last of these gatherings earlier this year, 12,000 college kids from all 50 states descended on DC. It was incredibly beautiful for those of us older than college age. I mean, I got to stand up there and talk to them and look out at this sea of people and see absolutely for sure that the idea that there was some kind of apathetic generation in our colleges was not true. That they were stepping up to the challenge and indeed beginning to lead it. And I know that's happening here. So after we'd done all this, after Barack Obama had said, yeah, that's right, we were feeling quite good. We were, in fact, I believe the technical term would be smug. We were very happy. 6 weeks later, the Arctic started to melt. And we were reminded that our targets were too low. And we were reminded that what we needed was global action, not even one nation at a time. And so we launched this campaign, 350.org. And it's the same basic idea, but on a global scale. It's really why I'm here. On October 24th this year, a date I hope you will write down, on October 24th this year, there will be thousands of actions all over the world, all designed merely to take this number and drive it into the public imagination, into the public consciousness, in the hope that we can really reboot this discussion before Copenhagen, that we can turn it from the kind of tired conversation that we're having now about how slowly we can get away with doing things, into a conversation about how we must grab a hold of this situation now, right now, before it's too late. There will be people high up in the Himalayas. There will be teams of people on Easter Island. There will be rallies going on in big cities and small towns. We were in New Zealand for a week last week, and every place we went, people came up with great ideas. At the local farmers union, we're going to pile 350 pumpkins in a great pyramid. We were in Dunedin, no problem, we will have 350 surfers out on the break, on and on and on, group after group, Oxfam, Greenpeace, everybody joining in. We're going to have a huge screen that day at the United Nations, and it'll be hooked up to a computer, and as people upload images from around the world, they'll be flashing there so that our diplomats will understand what the desire and the demand of people around the world really is. I do not know what images you will send because I don't know Australia well enough to know what symbols will help you get across the message here and to the rest of us in the world. I don't know whether it's surfers or lifeguards or kangaroos or barbecues or opera houses or whatever it is, that all the different things and places and iconic spots that you can bring to bear, what power you can bring to bear. I know that the most moving thing in New Zealand was to talk to a lot of Maori and have them say that on sacred and special places in that land, they would make sure that as first light dawned, they would be making the moment known. Australia will play a big role. You guys are early in the day. You have to help light the fuse that makes this thing work. And I can't promise you that it will work. We may have waited too long to get started. there are scientists who say that the momentum of these systems is already great enough that bringing them under control is impossible. And there are political scientists who say that the array of interests opposed to doing enough, opposed to moving swiftly, will be able to slow the process down past the point of no return. But for the moment, the science, the consensus science, is that there is a narrow window opening, narrow and closing. Maybe time to jump through it if we run swiftly and act bravely. I cannot promise you it'll work. It's not like other social problems. When we in the States think about movements and change, we always hearken back to the Civil Rights Movement, to our great moments in the 1960s when people were able to galvanize the conscience of a nation and enact real change. They had to be far braver than we have to be. No one's going to shoot you for talking about climate change, but they had one great advantage that we don't, which is that they knew they would win in the end. Martin Luther King, the night before he was shot, gave a sermon that doubtless some of you have heard on tape. It's a beautiful sermon. I've been to the mountaintop. I have seen the promised land. I do not know if I will get there with you. And of course he didn't. He was gunned down hours later. But I know you will get there. I know you will get there. It may take a while. He ended every talk that he ever gave by quoting from the abolitionist preacher Theodore Parker. He said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We will win in the end." A very comforting idea, a trope, in fact, that Obama used in his inaugural address, if you go back and listen. And Obama is one of the fruits of that movement. The trouble is that the arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. And that's what's happening now, and if we do not get a hold of it soon, then the next generation of people will not have a chance to get a hold of it. And so it is worth the chance of trying. I know it's worth the chance of trying because I get to open the email some days at our various offices, come into our various offices now that are scattered around the world. And it's unbelievably moving. We have a short 90-second animated video that maybe I'll show you in a minute. It has no words because one of the difficulties of organizing globally is the insistence of people around the world on speaking their own language, you know. So you can't use words. That's why numbers, Arabic numerals translate everywhere, and that's useful. That's why 350 is so helpful. We got an email from Cameroon in West Africa. A peasant farmer had seen this video on the little tiny screen on his cell phone. They didn't have internet, but you have to go far back and beyond to find some place without a cell phone in the village now. He'd seen it and he'd understood it. He and his neighbors had gotten together and they had planted 350 trees on the edge of their village. Hung a little sign on it and sent us a picture. Well, that was very useful. We got it on the front page of the Cameroon Times, or whatever it is, the next day, you know. More to the point, it was very moving. Rest assured that people in the Cameroon have done nothing to cause global warming. This is not their fault, okay? But they've come to understand that in a newly connected world, there is some way for them and for all of us to play some significant role in making it end, in rousing the kind of consciousness that gives us some hope, anyway, of dealing with what right now seems like an insuperable problem. Some hope, which is all that I can offer you. I'm extraordinarily grateful to you all for coming and listening. I'm even more grateful to the many of you that I'm pretty sure will help us out on October 24th and in the time ahead. Thank you all very much.
Could I ask for some questions from the floor, please? There are microphones just on each of the corridors here. Thank you.
And as we're waiting for questions, maybe we could just show this video so you can get a sense of what people around the world are seeing, and then we'll go right to questions. It's been viewed a few zillion times, I believe, on YouTube by now. Can't hear it. It's a new and interesting world when for $7,000 you can put something like that together and then have it seen millions upon millions of times. ExxonMobil may have 40 billion, you know, from last year, but they're not going to produce anything better than that, you know, with it. So that's our shot.
Hi Bill, thanks for that. Fiona Wayne, Environment Business Australia, and my apologies for, and thanks to John for chasing me up today. Well done, mate. Somebody asked me the other day to give a simple guide to emissions trading because they thought it was all too confusing out there. So I said, well, imagine it being like bounty hunters. You've got to catch the bad guys, you've got to kill the bad guys, and that in and of itself puts a price on the head of the anti-commodity, and then it starts to prevent that anti-commodity from proliferating around the world. What I would like to put to you is that we have, and climate change may be just one example of this, we have lost a sense of value of anything around the world. And I'm not just talking about moral value, I mean real economic value as well. So I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. I'm going to disagree with a phrase that you said, and that was, we can't change this, i.e. carbon, the integral part of the economy. I think we can. I think we've got enough technologies available, and I'm not going to stand here and espouse my pet technologies, but I do think we have the capacity now to build new markets, new industries, and new jobs. But it's the value system and getting the finance sector, the technology,
I completely agree with you.
All wrapped up together.
I completely agree with you. I think the task in some ways is less difficult than we anticipate of this energy transition. It'll be very difficult because it is the key part of our economy, but you're right. The minute that it will start to happen, the minute that it will really start to change fast, is the minute that carbon carries some price. That's the problem at the moment. Every good idea, from solar panels and windmills to conservation technology to local food to whatever it is, swims upstream against the force of economic gravity. As long as we have exceedingly cheap coal setting the gravitational economic force of the universe, then it's almost impossible for those things to flower in anything like the volume that they need to make a serious dent. The minute that that equation changes and the things that we need have the economic wind at their back, then the possibilities become radically different, I think. And I think you're absolutely right. I think economic history shows that we often move much more quickly than we believed was possible once we manage to get some of the incentives correct. And at the moment we have them so completely backwards that it's amazing we're making any progress at all, frankly, at the moment. And so that part of me is very hopeful. The difficulty is that we have to do it so quickly, that science asks us to do it so quickly. It would be much nicer to do this over a slightly less quick time frame, because it would allow us to make all the economic changes less dramatically. Okay? China has been building coal-fired power plants for the last 10 years at the rate of 1 or 2 a week. Okay? And those are all based on the idea that they're going to pay off over the next 40 or 50 years. The data from places like NASA indicate that if we're not out of the business of burning coal by 2030, and really in the Western world before that, that there's almost no chance that we'll ever get back to 350. That means we're going to have to eat a lot of what economists would call sunk costs. It's going to be a difficult process, but it's a process that we have to go through. And I'm rambling a little bit here, but the point I want to get across is that in our tired now political debate, we've made one basic mistake. We believe that these negotiations are between industry and environmentalists, between the coal industry and the Green Party, between China and America and Australia. In some sense, that's true. These negotiations at Copenhagen will be the most important international negotiations there have ever been. But the real negotiation that's underway behind it is the negotiation between human beings on the one hand and chemistry and physics on the other. Okay? And the problem with that negotiation is that chemistry and physics don't haggle, they don't bargain, they don't compromise, they don't meet you halfway, they don't wait until the recession is over so it's more convenient for you. They don't do any of that. They just do what they do. You can't amend the laws of nature the same way you can amend the tax code, It doesn't work, and that's the reality that 350 represents that we have to deal with.
Donnie McClurkin from Project Australia. If 20 years ago greenhouse gas emissions were the elephant in the room, I put it to you that the elephant in the room at the moment is economic growth, and growth more generally. What's it going to take to get those issues on the agenda?
My last book, believe it or not, in between, I basically have given up thinking and now just talk, But I do occasionally still think, and my last book was a book called Deep Economy. And it really was a question, it was really a sort of treatise on this question of whether or not we may have reached the place where economic growth, at least as we understand it, no longer makes the sense that perhaps it once did. Again, I think that the key variable here is the price of energy. The thing that's underwritten 200 years of very rapid economic growth has been the availability of cheap fossil fuel. In essence, the availability of a kind of, endless set of slaves for all of us to do immense quantities of work, and more all the time. We're not going to replace fossil fuel one for one with something that works exactly the same way. We've had our magic fuel, Coal and gas and oil were great stuff, easy to get at, rich in BTUs, you could transport them around. The logic of the things that replace them, the sun, the wind, whatever, is somewhat different. I think that these things will work. My house runs on the sun. But I also understand that they're more diffuse and spread out. And I think the logic of them is less a logic of globalization and more a logic of localization. That we will begin to see over the next 50 years, indeed we're already seeing it, a shortening of supply lines, a return to somewhat more localized economies. In America, the fastest growing part of the food economy is local farmers markets. Sales have been growing 10 or 15% a year. And one of the things that's important about that is not only that they're more ecologically sound, but that they imagine the kind of different worldview that I think you may be getting at. One way to think about the effects of fossil fuel is, not only has it made us rich and not only has it destroyed our climate, it's also made us the first members of our species to have no practical need of our neighbors for anything, okay? To be able to be hyper-individualist in a way that no other human could have imagined, and that turns out to be deeply psychologically unhealthy. The average American is, the number of Americans who say that they're very happy with their lives, the percentage, peaked in 1956 and has gone steadily downhill since. Barely a quarter of Americans will make that claim, even though their material standard of living has trebled over that period. And the reason is that in the pursuit of the American dream, which was easy to define, bigger houses farther apart from each other, okay, we lost contact with each other. The average American has half as many close friends as the average American of 50 years ago. Eats meals with friends and family half as often. I read on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald today that only 6% of Australian barbecues involve anybody from outside the family, that it's, you know, the same phenomenon at work. Well, at the farmer's market, a pair of sociologists last year followed shoppers, first around the supermarket, then around the farmer's market. I assume supermarkets work the same way in Australia that they do in the States. You enter, you fall into a light fluorescent trance, you visit the stations of the cross around the market, you emerge with the same basket of items as you had the week before. When they followed people around the farmer's market, they found that they were having, on average, 10 times more conversations per visit. They were beginning to make that community work again, to reweave some of that lost web. And that, I think, is going to be very important. Among other things, strong communities will be necessary to help deal with that which we cannot ward off in the years ahead, because we're not going to stop global warming. If we do everything right, we will slow it down. But there are many effects coming that'll make life more difficult than the life of incredible stability that we have enjoyed. And hence we will need those communities for many things. So I think the world will change in the years ahead in profoundly interesting ways.
Bill, I'm Robert Jacopetter, and I'm part of Australia's modern-day version of Noah's Ark, being the Australian religious response to climate change. So given religious people are often quite passionate about their beliefs and will act quite significantly because of them, and given the problem you referred to about mobilisation, then I'm wondering to what extent is 350.org engaged with religious communities? For example, how many communities globally of at least 350 people could gather, each praying in their own traditional manner, to try and make the point?
Well, that's an excellent idea. We're engaged hard with religious communities around the world in all kinds of ways. One thing we want very much to happen, and it sounds to me like you're the man to make it happen, we need, in the States we know already that we will have, and other places, thousands of churches ringing their bells 350 times on October 24th. Okay? No radio reporter can resist going and doing a story about that. Why is the church bell ringing, you know? Church bells, at least where I live, before we had modern communications, when something caught on fire, that's what you rang to let everybody in town know, well, something is on fire, you know? And so a good moment to ring those bells. Many other traditions. We got an email not long ago from the Buddhist kingdom of Ladakh, high in the Himalayas. Somehow they had heard about all of this. And they'd gotten together and they'd had a day in their capital city, which is called Leh, and they had a conference about 350 that apparently, among other things, featured a 94-year-old man who gave an hour-long disquisition on how the weather had changed throughout his lifetime, you know, people listen. At the end of the day, the picture we got was of 1,500 Buddhist monks and nuns grouped in a huge human 350 with the Himalayas as a backdrop. very beautiful to see, very beautiful to have the Dalai Lama issue a kind of whatever it's called, when the Dalai Lama issues something, saying that this is the right number, for which to aim, and calling on people to do it. All of that, so beautiful to see happening. Please spread that work here. And all of you who are interested in this, we need you very much to sort of take the bit in your mouth and run with it. When we started this a year ago, there were 7 of us at work on it, which meant that each one of us had a continent, to organize. Now there's more. We have offices in Johannesburg and the Congo and Quito and Malaysia and Budapest and Berlin and San Francisco, and there's people, but it's basically still a, bring your own kind of dinner. I mean, we're calling the date and we're telling you the theme, but you have to do the cooking. And so you have your assignment now for October 24th.
Bill, the recession in many ways, I guess, has signalled the demise of the neoliberal project. I guess we need some paradigm shift now to fill that ideological vacuum. Many environmentalists regard the economy as a highly dependent subsystem of the environment. I wonder if you've given any thought to the Australian concept of permaculture and how those principles might help us through this difficult transition.
It's actually a very good image or metaphor to use, to start thinking. And since we were just talking about religion, you can sort of think about it in some of the same ways. We come from very linear traditions. And one of the problems with linear traditions is that you tend to feel the need for more with each passing year or each passing quarter, as it now happens, The only acceptable result for fiscal quarter, third quarter of 09 is to have more than you had and if you're not, it's big trouble. And as the way things are set up now, it is big trouble. People don't have enough to eat. Okay. It's very useful sometimes to get outside that paradigm and to go to places that still remain rural and that perhaps partake of more cyclical Eastern ideas about the world, where people are less passionate about that and more able to understand that, when the spring of 09 comes around, or when the fall of 09 comes around, what you need to have is the same amount of wood and food and whatever that you had last fall in order to get you through the winter. That's a very simplified way of putting it, of course, and one can, in a complex and modern world, we need to extend that metaphor in many directions. But I do think that the period of endless growth is coming to an end, that it was based very largely on the consumption of fossil fuel, and that we will move into a more interesting and fruitful moment when concepts like durability, stability, security, permanence are more interesting to us. Maybe less exciting, but more interesting. And you can almost feel it psychologically right now. I don't know this for sure, but my strong feeling, at least in the States, is that this last recession, or whatever we're calling it, has been sharp and shocking enough that it may actually leave a strong residue in attitudes, that we won't go back to exactly the same kind of heedless, endless consumption that marked the period we've just come through, that something more interesting and dawning. But all of these things are chicken and egg and interwoven, and all of them in the end are dependent on taking action quickly to keep the one great emergency from becoming so overpowering that it prevents us from taking real action about anything.
My name is Alison Heathcote, and I'm not famous. And I'm just an ordinary person. But I do claim to a little bit of fame because I'm president of Permaculture Central Coast, which is about an hour north. So I was wondering if you'd heard of the Transition Towns movement.
Indeed.
And that's not actually my question, but I just threw that in because he mentioned permaculture. So the question I have here, last week I came down here to a film put on by Clean Up Australia called Crimes Against Nature. It was an amazing film. It's about how the Bush administration has appointed over the last 7 or 8 years a whole mass of foxes to look after the chickens in the climate change departments of the US. And I noticed today, by strange coincidence on the front page of the Australian, that Greg Combay is Parliamentary Secretary for Climate Change. Now, he happens to be the federal member for Charleston, which is in the middle of the Hunter Valley, which is one of our major coal-producing. And I'm just wondering whether you can, with your limited knowledge maybe of Australian politics, whether you can work out if Mr. Rudd is following Mr. Bush's example and putting a whole mass of foxes in the climate change henhouse.
It's very funny. For the last 36 hours, I've been playing, pretending to be an authority on all politics. People keep asking me questions on TV, and I keep confidently struggling to remember the first name of the Prime Minister, so I don't sound like a complete idiot, on the Kevin. Yes, I figured it out eventually. And look, it's however bad or good or whatever he is. Trust me, there's nobody like George Bush, okay? May we never see the like again. Here's what I think is going on. In fact, I just wrote a little op-ed piece for the Los Angeles Times this afternoon talking about what's going on in Australia and the United States at the same time. And it's actually quite similar in our Congress right now. I think the problem is not lack of good faith on the part of your Prime Minister. I don't know him, so I haven't looked in his eyes and understood this, but what I think is going on is what I said before. We haven't given them enough political space to work with. We haven't built enough of a political movement to give them the opportunity to do what they want to do. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, memorably said once when some group came to demand something of him in the 1930s, he said, "I agree with you completely. Now go out there and make me do it." Okay? We haven't assembled the numbers and the pressure yet to allow that to happen. You guys have you fought an election over this, and it was very good and useful. And even that hasn't yet been enough to counterbalance the enormous pressure, especially in a tough economic time, from vested interest on the world. And so one of the things that we can do is, beyond working just in our own nations, work at this for the first time on a global basis so that pressure is being applied everywhere all at once. When they get to Copenhagen, every single prime minister and president in the world has a Hunter Valley someplace that they have to worry about. They have a vested interest someplace that they have to worry about. The only way that they will make this happen is if they all hold hands and jump together, okay? I mean, Obama will have to lead the jumping, but that's how it's going to work, all right? And that means that pressure applied in Australia is pressure applied on the whole world, and some of that pressure will come back here. We've somewhat wrongly defined, I think, the place in which we need to put that pressure. And it's not just on our own national governments, it's on the whole world system. That's very difficult to do. That's strategically what we've tried to do with 350.org, really in some ways for the first time, and we'll see if we can make it work. Thank you.
I've been a member for a long time of 350.org, and we've already established we're going to do something on October 24th at Permaculture Central Coast.
Fantastic.
We're with you. Thank you.
Yes.
Jessica from the Australian Youth Climate Coalition.
Hi.
Hi. We're building, as you may know, a generation-wide movement to solve climate change. Because, as you've been saying tonight, it's all about stories. And the young people of Australia are at the very beginning of their story, and we'd like to be able to have a positive ending to it, and preferably even a sequel for the future. So, to do that, we're holding things like Power Shift. We know that young people, in our minds, it's the number one emergency. It is. And we are coming together to make a difference. But how do you think we can make this everyone's number one emergency? How can we scale it down to the level of every single person so they take it on and actually do something about it?
It's a very good question. And first of all, let me say that one of the most important things is doing just what you're doing, which is building a youth movement, okay? Kids are more motivated than, you know, I've got 25 years to live with this problem. You've got 60 years to live with it, okay? That's important to understand. Those of you who are thinking, how, you know, perhaps I could help someone by writing a check. We don't spend much money at 350.org. We're kind of weird, decentralized, whatever. Power Shift and the youth climate, I bet, could use some money to make that movement go, to make Power Shift really work, that kind of thing. So take that opportunity if you're so inclined. It's incredibly important. It's been the thing in the States and in many other places that's really helped drive this to the fore. In terms of getting everyone involved, well, that's too ambitious a goal. We're not going to get everyone, and we don't need to get everyone, okay? Political change happens when you get some fraction of the population vocally engaged, okay? And that's enough, you know? But we need to get many more than we're getting now. And of course, one of the problems of the environmental movement is that it's defined its demographic far too narrowly. We need to move outside affluent and suburban and white and whatever, and think a lot about urban communities. We need to think a lot about people whose basic orientation isn't towards political action at all, but towards other things. So we've done all that we can to get, say, around the world athletes really interested. We have a few celebrity athletes, this sort of Team 350 that you'll see on the website, but what they're doing is making sure if they're a Tour de France biker that they're organizing a bike ride of 350 people that day or going 350 kilometers, that they're involving lots of other people. You know, if they're a surfer, that they're, you know, you get the point I'm making. And the same with religious communities, and the same with urban communities. In the States, we work with a wonderful, powerful political grouping called the Hip Hop Caucus that does really good work in urban communities, and whose, you know, the movement marches to a beat quite different than the sort of guy with a guitar sort of, you know, thing that environmentalists are sort of traditionally into. I mean, it's nice sometimes to have it a little louder than that, you know, and whatever. So that's what we're trying hard to do, and I know that you're trying to do the same things here. Build out, build out, build out. We've forced the really noble people in the environmental movement who are spending all their time in our national capitals lobbying, doing really hard work lobbying, we forced them to work with too little. The people that they lobby know that they are essentially naked, that there are not enough people behind them to scare the people with whom they're talking, okay, which is what lobbying basically is about. And so we need to make that large enough to happen. It doesn't have to be everybody. 5% of people is enough to drive any political system, you know, and if they're vocal and active. So thank you very much for your work.
My name is Norbert Kelvin. I've been involved in the coal industry in research and in more lately teaching environmental engineering in Ireland. And thank you very much, Bill, for your exposition. It's, I think we've learned quite a bit. And I much appreciate your comments about the fact that physics and chemistry are not very forgiving or not very accommodating, certainly not to market forces and political forces. But there is a question that that arises that we have some physics and chemistry that has to be achieved, or engineering and physics and chemistry that have to be achieved in order to achieve what you would like to see, what we would all like to see, is a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. And the physics and chemistry and engineering seem to be remarkably deficient in one particular technology that the French have adopted. And now that's a very democratic and open society, or it was when I was there last, about a year ago, and we don't hear of any revolutions or anything making it a closed society. And they seem to have been able to organise their electricity supply to the effect that 80% of the TGVs and public transport run on nuclear electricity. And I'm wondering why in Australia we are so averse to that technology. And secondly, why, for example, are the Irish Greens now advocating nuclear energy? Now, that's not an Irish joke, but it's a serious proposition on the part of European
And it's
Greens.
a very interesting question, because, of course, you know, risk calculations do change over time. 20 years ago, a nuclear power plant was the single scariest thing you could think of, because if something went wrong, and we know that they sometimes do because we've seen it happen, the results are quite horrible, okay? We now know and understand that a coal-fired power plant, nothing has to go wrong. If you operate it exactly the way it's supposed to operate, it destroys the world, okay? But my guess is that going forward, in all the econometric modeling I've seen, nuclear power is going to play a vanishingly small role. And the reason is what an economist would call opportunity cost. That is, the cost of building nuclear power plants and the time it takes, and hence the capital and investment costs, are high enough that it almost certainly makes more sense to spend that money on other technologies. The first place, if we get the cost of carbon right, that we will quickly find money flowing is into conservation, and that will happen with great rapidity. There will be people calling your house all the time, offering to come make it tight and efficient, and you will be welcoming the call because you'll be getting a strong price signal to do that. You know, the biggest difference between Western Europe and the rest of us is not how they provide their power, it's that they use so little of it. The average Western European uses half as much energy as the average American. So the latest set of numbers I've seen, and these are about 5 weeks old, and these are from the States, are that new nuclear power plants would cost roughly 22 American cents a kilowatt hour for electricity, which is a very high price even in a kind of carbon-constrained world. And I think that the market left to itself is almost certainly going to choose wind and sun and conservation on the hierarchy ahead of nuclear power. So that's, I think, what's going on. And of course, we haven't solved the set of problems that we should solve with nuclear power. I'm willing to grant that there are now things scarier, but it remains something slightly irresponsible about not knowing what to do with the waste and so on and so forth. But I think that's the reason that it's not getting more priority. At least in the States, the only way that we're going to build nuclear power plants is if Congress decides to subsidize them to an enormous extent, okay? And if they're going to spend that kind of money, there's almost certainly more economically efficient things to spend it on. Thank you.
This is ABC Fora,